At 18, she was given, still a virgin, to a widowed rancher with 3 children. What happened shocked all. The wind of Wyoming's high plains cut like a sharpened blade, whistling through bare branches and moaning across the sagging frame of a crooked farmhouse. Snowflakes, slow and deliberate, drifted down from the pewter sky, softening wagon ruts and footprints until all sign of passage seemed erased. On the porch of that weary home stood Laura May, barely 18, her small hands hidden beneath a coarse woolen shawl. The shawl was frayed at the edges, smelling faintly of smoke and lye soap, but she clutched it as though it were armor. Her face was pale in the winter light, lips dry, eyes wide and unblinking. She did not shiver, though the wind bit through her thin dress. She had learned young that showing weakness was only fuel for ridicule in this house. Her gaze clung to the whiteness beyond the porch, as though praying some rider might appear out of the storm, some force to halt what was coming. But the land was empty, silent except for the whistle of wind against timber. Inside the house, warmth pressed against the windows, orange flickers of fire casting shifting shadows across rough-hewn walls. Laura's uncle, a thick-bodied man with a face soured by regret, leaned one boot on the hearthstone, arms crossed over his chest. The years had made him heavy, both in body and in bitterness. His eyes, sharp but weary, held none of the softness of kinship. Across from him stood a taller figure, dusted in snow, his trail coat dark and worn, his hat in his hand. Clayton Ward, rancher, 36 years old, a widower, with 3 children left in his care. His face was weather-carved, his jaw hard as stone, his gray eyes steady as winter ash. He was a man who seemed made of silence. No fidgeting, no wasted words. Laura lingered in the doorway, half-hidden, as her uncle's voice broke the crackle of the fire. "I told you," he said, with a gruffness sharpened by pride. "She's untouched. Still a virgin. Fresh as morning milk." The words cut Laura like a lash. Her cheeks flushed with hot shame, though the men did not look her way. Her uncle spoke as though she were cattle to be weighed, her worth measured by purity. She pressed her fingers harder into her shawl to keep from trembling. Clayton's eyes flicked toward her for the briefest moment, an unreadable glance, neither hungry nor tender, only assessing. Then his gaze returned to the fire. He did not smirk, nor nod at the uncle's coarse phrasing. His stillness unsettled her more than if he had spoken. The uncle spat into the fire and continued, "You'll not find another like her, Ward. A girl raised decent, no trouble in her blood. She'll keep your house, tend your young uns. A fair trade, considering what you're paying." Trade. The word made Laura's stomach turn. She shifted against the frame, nails digging into the wood. Clayton's voice came at last, low and measured. "I didn't come for a servant, Mr. Yates. I came because your kin's got no place else to go, and my children need a steady hand in the house." The uncle barked a humorless laugh. "Spare me your noble talk. You've coin. She's got youth." We're both walking away satisfied. Laura's eyes darted toward Clayton. His jaw tightened at her uncle's words, but his expression remained unreadable, as if carved from stone. Her uncle crossed the room, yanked open a small box, and drew out a folded paper. "Sign here," he said, thrusting it toward Clayton. "Simple as that. You'll take her with you tonight." The paper blurred in Laura's vision. She wanted to cry out, to beg for time, for mercy, for some miracle. But her throat locked. Her whole life, she had learned to be quiet. Quiet when her uncle's temper rose. Quiet when food was scarce. Quiet when plans were made over her head. Clayton set his hat down on the table, took the pen, and bent over the paper. The scratching sound of ink seemed louder than the storm outside. When he straightened, the deed was done. Her uncle clapped the paper shut, satisfied, and grinned with the smugness of a man who believed himself clever. "There, she's yours now. Best you get her out before the snow buries you both." The word struck Laura's heart with finality. "Yours now." Clayton reached for his coat, sliding it back over broad shoulders. His movements were steady, without haste, as though storms and bargains and lives upended were all part of the same rhythm. He crossed the room to where Laura stood frozen. "You want to fetch what's yours," he said quietly. His voice held no cruelty, but no gentleness either, just an unvarnished truth. Laura blinked up at him, startled by the depth of his eyes, then lowered hers quickly. I don't have much." "Then it won't take long." She hurried to the corner room, where her small trunk sat beneath the window. Inside it, a faded Bible, her mother's handkerchief, and 2 dresses patched more times than she could count. She touched each item as though they might anchor her to the life she was leaving behind. When she returned, Clayton was already at the door, coat collar turned against the cold. He took her trunk in one hand, as though it weighed nothing. Her uncle stood by the fire, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Not a word of farewell, no blessing, no sign that she had once been kin beneath his roof. Laura swallowed hard, then stepped out into the blizzard, her shawl tight around her shoulders. The wind struck her at once, slicing through the fabric, stealing her breath. The snow stung her face, blinded her eyes, but Clayton walked steady ahead, leading her toward the waiting wagon. Its wooden boards creaked under the weight of pack supplies, the horses shifting impatiently. He lifted her trunk into the bed, then turned, offering his hand. She hesitated. This man she did not know, whose life she was bound to, whose children she would face. For a moment, her eyes searched his face. No greed, no cruelty, only a steady, quiet resolve. She placed her hand in his. His palm was rough, calloused, warm despite the cold. He helped her into the wagon without a word. The reins snapped, the horses lunged forward, and the farmhouse shrank into a blur of white behind them. Laura pulled the shawl tighter, staring into the storm. Fear knotted her chest, but beneath it stirred something unexpected, an ember of defiance, a whisper that perhaps her story had not ended here. Beside her, Clayton Ward drove in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not look at her, but she could feel the weight of his presence, solid and immovable against the storm. And so began her new life, given, not chosen. But destiny, she felt, was watching from somewhere just beyond the snow. The journey to the ranch stretched long into the night. Snow swirled in restless spirals around the wagon, the horses' hooves crunching through drifts with steady rhythm. Laura sat stiff on the bench beside Clayton, her shawl pulled close, her breath rising in pale clouds. He hadn't spoken since they left her uncle's farm. His silence weighed heavier than the storm. At last, lantern light flickered in the distance, bobbing faintly against the black sky. As they drew nearer, a house came into view, a 2-story ranch home, its timbers weathered gray by wind and sun, its roof thick with snow. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, a frail ribbon against the vastness of the plains. Clayton reined the horses to a halt and climbed down, his boots sinking into the snow. He offered Laura his hand again, steady and wordless, as he helped her down. For a moment, Laura simply stood, staring at the house that was now hers by law, though it felt as foreign as a castle. Its windows glowed with amber light, warm and alive, yet the walls seemed to carry shadows, echoes of a woman who had once ruled this household. Clayton shouldered her trunk and led her inside. The warmth of the fire wrapped around her instantly, the scent of wood smoke mingling with bread long cooled and stew reheated too many times. The front room was plain but tidy, rough-hewn furniture, a threadbare rug, shelves lined with jars of preserves, and a heavy table scarred from years of use. But what struck Laura most were the eyes. 3 pairs of them, watching her from the hearth. The children. The eldest, a girl of 12, sat straight-backed in a chair, her hands folded in her lap, her dark hair braided neatly. Annie Ward. Her eyes, wide and wary, scanned Laura from head to toe with a sharpness that carried more judgment than curiosity. Beside her, a boy of about 9 lounged on the hearth rug, elbows on his knees. Thomas, restless energy burning in his posture. His hair was uncombed, his boots scuffed. He tilted his head, frowning, as if trying to measure the stranger standing in his mother's place. And near the fire, clutching a rag doll with one button missing, stood Sarah, barely 5. Her face was round, her eyes big with innocence. She peered at Laura from behind the safety of Annie's skirt, half curious, half frightened. The silence was sharp enough to hear the pop of the firewood. "This is Laura," Clayton said, his voice firm but even. "She'll be here now. I expect you'll treat her with respect." The words sounded less like an introduction and more like a decree. Laura's throat tightened. She managed a small, careful smile. "Hello." Her voice was softer than she intended, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. None of the children answered. Annie's lips pressed into a line. Thomas snorted and looked away, tugging at a loose thread on his shirt. Sarah only clutched her doll tighter. Clayton set the trunk down with a thud and shrugged off his coat. "Laura, you'll sleep in the room at the end of the hall. The children will show you where things are in the morning." And just like that, he moved past them, heading toward the back room where Laura guessed his own chamber lay. The silence thickened again, broken only when Thomas muttered, "She ain't Ma." Annie's voice, sharp and older than her years, cut through. "Don't be rude." But her eyes never left Laura, cool and unyielding. Laura felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to sink into the floor, to vanish into the shadows. She had never pretended she could replace the woman these children had lost. Yet here she was, thrust into her shoes. She stepped closer to the fire, pulling her shawl tighter. Sarah's eyes darted up at her, then away. Laura crouched slightly, softening her voice. "That's a pretty doll you've got." The little girl peeked at her again. "Her name's Daisy." Laura smiled. "I had one once. Her name was Rose. She went everywhere with me." For the first time, Sarah's mouth twitched into something like a smile. But Annie's hand landed gently on her sister's shoulder, as if to pull her back. Laura straightened, the weight of the eldest girl's disapproval pressing heavy. Later, in the small room that was now hers, Laura sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The walls were bare, the quilt patched but clean. Her trunk sat at her feet. She did not unpack. Her shawl still clung to her shoulders, though the air was warm. Through the thin wall, she heard the children whispering in their room. Annie's voice was low but firm, carrying authority. "She's not staying. Pa doesn't care for her. He just needs help." Thomas whispered back, "She's too small to work, but she cries when it storms." Then Sarah's softer tone, "But she's nice." Laura closed her eyes, swallowing the ache in her throat. She wanted to prove them wrong, to be strong, capable, needed. But how could she, when she had never been mistress of anything, not even her own life? The sound of footsteps passed her door. Heavy, measured. Clayton. He paused outside. She could hear the floorboard groan beneath his weight. For a heartbeat, she wondered if he would knock. But the steps moved on. Laura lay back on the bed, staring up at the low ceiling. Hot tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. She had shed too many in her uncle's house. She would not cry here, not where strangers could hear. Still, in the silence, the tears slipped free. And though she did not know it, Clayton Ward, lying awake in his own room, heard the faint sound through the thin walls. He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening, his hand resting over the scar on his palm. A scar from a life built on duty, loss, and promises he wasn't sure he could keep again. In the darkness of that Wyoming night, two lives lay side by side in the same house, divided by walls, by years, by grief and fear. Yet already, something unseen was moving between them, fragile, unspoken, like the first ember beneath a pile of cold ash. The first days on the Ward Ranch passed like a test of endurance. Morning came early, long before the pale light crept over the snow-hardened hills. Laura would rise from her narrow bed, her shawl pulled close, and step into the kitchen where the coals of last night's fire still glowed faintly. She fumbled with kindling, coaxing flame with fingers numb from cold. Her first attempts at breakfast were clumsy, biscuits too hard, porridge too thin, bacon blackened at the edges. Annie's eyes, sharp and watchful, never missed a mistake. "Ma never burned bacon," she said one morning, her tone clipped, not cruel but cutting. Laura bit her lip, fighting back the sting of shame. "Then I'll try again," she answered quietly, scraping the pan clean. Thomas smirked, elbows on the table. but she can't even milk a cow. She looks like she'd get stepped on. But when Laura followed Clayton to the barn later, she surprised even herself. She had watched her mother once, years ago, before sickness claimed her, and though her hands were clumsy, the rhythm slowly came. The cow huffed, the bucket filled, and Clayton only nodded once, silent approval. The days were hard, but it was the nights that weighed on her most. The house was filled with whispers, memories lingering in every corner. At the dinner table, an empty chair at the end seemed always reserved for the woman Laura had replaced. Laura never dared sit there, though Clayton never spoke of it. Still, she endured, and slowly, the children began to see her not as an intruder, but as someone willing to try. One afternoon, the sun gleamed bright but weak, and the snow lay crusted and hard underfoot. Thomas begged to go to the pond down by the cottonwoods. "The ice is thick, Pa. We'll be fine." Clayton's voice was firm. "Stay off the pond. The thaw's coming." Thomas rolled his eyes, but said nothing. Annie gave Laura a look that seemed to say, "You'll never be able to keep him in line." Later, when Clayton rode out to mend a broken fence, Thomas tugged on his boots and motioned to his sisters. "Come on, let's just see it. Won't hurt." Annie hesitated, but Sarah clutched her doll and followed. Laura, seeing them slip out, pulled on her shawl and hurried after. The pond lay in a hollow, ringed by trees bare of leaves. Its surface shimmered glassy, thin sheets cracking faintly in the sun. Thomas had already scrambled down the bank, stomping onto the ice, grinning. "Thomas," Laura called, her voice sharper than she intended. "Your pa said no." He turned, his grin wide. "It's solid. Watch." The crack split like a gunshot. Laura's breath caught as Thomas plunged, his cries swallowed by the splash of freezing water. Annie screamed. Sarah dropped her doll and wailed. Laura didn't think. She ran, her boots slipping, her shawl flying behind her. She dropped to her stomach on the brittle ice, crawling toward the flailing boy. The water was black, claws of winter reaching for him. "Hold on," she cried, stretching her arm. Thomas's eyes were wild with terror, his hands thrashing. She lunged, her fingers locking around his wrist. The cold seared her skin, but she pulled with all her strength. The ice groaned, cracking beneath her, but she dragged him inch by inch until, with one final heave, he slid onto the frozen edge, gasping, coughing, shivering violently. Laura scrambled back, pulling him into her arms. He was soaked, his lips turning blue. Annie and Sarah rushed forward, faces pale with fear. "We have to get him home," Laura said, her teeth chattering from the wet seeping into her sleeves. Together, they half-carried, half-dragged Thomas up the hill. By the time they reached the house, Clayton's horse was already in the yard. He had returned sooner than expected. He strode forward, his eyes taking in the scene at once. Thomas dripping, Laura soaked and shaking, the girls in tears. "What happened?" His voice was iron. Thomas's lips trembled, but before he could speak, Laura stepped forward. "It was the pond," she said, her voice steady though her body shook. "He fell through. I got him out." Clayton's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and anger. He swept Thomas into his arms, carrying him inside, barking orders. "Annie, stoke the fire. Sarah, fetch blankets. Laura, change out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." His voice brooked no argument. Minutes later, Thomas sat by the fire, swaddled in blankets, color slowly returning to his cheeks. Clayton stood behind him, one hand gripping the back of the chair, the other rubbing his temple. He looked at Laura. "You risked your life," he said low, controlled. "That ice could have taken you both." Laura met his eyes. "I couldn't just stand by." Something in his expression shifted, an unspoken respect, but his words remained gruff. "Reckless or not, you saved him. That's not a thing easily forgotten." Thomas, cheeks still pale, looked up at her then. His voice was small, but clear. "Thank you, Ma." The word hung in the air. Annie's eyes flickered, torn between resistance and relief. Sarah, still clutching her doll, nodded solemnly. Laura's heart swelled and broke all at once. She touched Thomas's damp hair gently, blinking back tears. For the first time, she felt not just tolerated, but needed. That night, as the house settled into uneasy sleep, Laura lay awake. Through the wall, she could hear Clayton's footsteps pacing slowly, as though the day's fear still clung to him. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent vow. Whatever storms come, I will not let these children lose again. Not while I draw breath. In the stillness, the ice between them had begun to crack, not just on the pond, but in their hearts. The snow had begun to soften with the promise of spring. Mud appeared in ruts where drifts had melted, and the air carried a dampness that smelled of thawing earth. Life on the ranch found a rhythm, though not yet a comfortable one. Laura rose with the dawn, stoked fires, learned to bake bread without burning it, and stitched torn shirts by the light of the window. The children no longer eyed her as an intruder, though Annie's reserve remained a wall hard to climb. Thomas, after his brush with death, hovered around her more, fetching kindling, asking questions, eager for the approval he once dismissed. Little Sarah shadowed Laura's every move, her rag doll tucked under one arm, her wide eyes following with trust. But for all that was shifting inside the ranch, the world outside it had teeth. One Saturday, Clayton hitched the wagon for a trip into town. Supplies were low, and the children needed shoes that hadn't been patched to rags. Laura hadn't been beyond the ranch since she arrived, and though her heart fluttered with nerves, she needed, to prove herself beside him. The town was small, a scattering of buildings huddled along a muddy main street, their fronts faded and weather-beaten. A church steeple rose above them, its bell still dusted with frost. As the wagon rattled into town, heads turned. Men tipped hats at Clayton with respectful nods, but their eyes lingered on Laura. Women paused mid-step, their whispers stirring like dry grass in the wind. Laura kept her gaze down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Inside the mercantile, the warmth of the stove did little to ease the tension. Shelves lined with bolts of cloth, jars of candy, barrels of flour, and crates of nails surrounded them. The shopkeeper, Mr. Harris, greeted Clayton heartily, then gave Laura a long look that carried more curiosity than welcome. "So this is the new Mrs. Ward," he said at last, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ears of a woman at the back counter. Laura's cheeks heated. She opened her mouth to answer, but Clayton's even tone cut through. "This is Laura. She'll take what's needed." Laura busied herself with the list in her hand. Flour, sugar, lamp oil, buttons for Sarah's dresses. She gathered them with care, but the women nearby whispered behind their gloved hands. "Barely grown herself," one murmured. "Half his age," another hissed softly. "Taken straight from her kin like a parcel. She won't last a season." Laura's hands shook as she placed sugar on the counter. The words were sharp as thorns, pressing deeper with each syllable. She had feared the children's rejection, but she hadn't braced herself for the world beyond the ranch. Annie stood beside her, arms crossed, chin lifted. The girl's eyes darted to the women, then back to Laura. Her mouth opened, then closed again, caught between her own doubts and an instinct to protect. Thomas, bolder, scowled outright. "Pa don't need you women talking," he muttered, his voice a boy's version of defiance. Laura gave him a quick shake of the head, silently pleading not to stir trouble. When they stepped back outside, arms laden with parcels, Clayton adjusted the reins but paused, his eyes scanning the street. A man leaned against a post, watching Laura with a look that made her stomach twist, part curiosity, part something darker. "Ward," the man called, spitting tobacco into the mud. "Heard you bought yourself a girl fresh out of her uncle's house. Must be nice, starting over with something so young." A harsh laugh rose from another bystander. Laura froze, shame burning hot in her chest, her breath caught. Clayton's jaw set hard. He stepped forward, his shadow falling across the man. His voice, low and deadly calm, carried farther than if he had shouted. "You'll hold your tongue." The man smirked, but it faltered under Clayton's stare. The silence stretched taut, and then the man spat again and turned away, muttering. Clayton returned to the wagon, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at Laura, but his hand, rough and steady, helped her up as though nothing had happened. As the wagon rolled out of town, Laura's hands gripped the edge of the seat. They think, she faltered, voice breaking. They think I was bought. Clayton kept his eyes on the road. People will say what they want. Their words don't put food on my table, and they don't raise my children. But it hurts, she whispered. For the first time, his eyes flicked toward her, the gray depths softening just a fraction. Let them talk. You know who you are? And the children will too, in time. That's all that matters. His words were plain, unpolished, but something in them steadied her. That evening, back at the ranch, Annie lingered as Laura unpacked the supplies. The girl's face was tight, her eyes flickering with something she seemed to wrestle inside. Is it true? She blurted at last. Did you marry my pa for money? The question struck Laura harder than the whispers in town. She turned, her hands trembling around the sack of flour she held. Annie, she said softly, I didn't marry him for money. I didn't have a choice. But her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. But I promise you this, I won't leave you. Not for coin, not for whispers. I'm here. For you, for Thomas, for Sarah, for your father. For as long as I'm wanted. Annie's lips pressed into a line, but something flickered in her gaze. Doubt? Yes, but also the first fragile glimmer of belief. That night, Laura sat by the fire sewing a patch on Sarah's doll. The children dozed nearby, the house quiet save for the crackle of wood. Clayton entered from the cold, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He paused, watching her hands move carefully over the tiny fabric dress. Laura looked up. She wouldn't let me put her to bed until Daisy had her clothes mended. For the first time, Clayton's mouth curved. Not a smile, not fully, but something close. You've done more than patch a doll tonight. Laura blinked, her heart catching. I only stitched a tear. His eyes lingered on hers, steady and unreadable, before he turned toward the back hall. But his voice, low and certain, carried back. You belong here now. The words settled into Laura like a balm, pushing back against the sting of town gossip. For the first time since leaving her uncle's house, she felt a thread tying her not to shame, but to purpose. The Wyoming winds had quieted that evening, a rare hush settling over the plains. The sky was moonless, the stars sharp as needles, and the air smelled faintly of thawing soil. Laura had just finished tucking Sarah into bed. The little girl's curls spread across her pillow when the sound reached her, faint at first, then swelling into something unmistakable. A crackle, a pop, then a low, roaring hiss. Laura froze in the hallway. Moments later, Thomas burst inside, his face white as bone. The barn, he cried, breath ragged. It's on fire. Laura raced to the door. Out in the night, orange tongues licked skyward, devouring the wooden walls of the barn. Sparks shot into the dark like fireflies, and the animals inside shrieked in terror. Clayton was already running toward the blaze, a bucket in one hand, his voice cutting sharp through the chaos. Get water from the well. Thomas, pump. Annie, help your brother. Laura didn't think, didn't hesitate. She grabbed her skirts in both hands and sprinted toward the barn, the icy ground biting through her thin shoes. The fire was fierce, faster than she had imagined fire could be. Heat blasted her face, singeing the ends of her hair. Smoke clawed her lungs. She could see the outlines of panicked horses, a cow thrashing against its tether, the bleating of goats rising in terrified cries. Clayton's voice thundered, "Stay back." But she couldn't. Not when she heard Sarah's soft voice behind her. "Daisy, my doll's in there." It wasn't just animals. The rag doll she had mended, the doll Sarah loved, was inside on a shelf near the tack room. To Sarah, it was everything. Laura's legs moved before her mind caught up. She yanked her shawl over her nose and mouth, then darted through the barn door. The world became fire. The smoke was a living thing, searing her throat, blinding her eyes. She stumbled forward, coughing, her hands outstretched. The goats bleated, tethered near the door. With fumbling fingers, she untied the knots, shoving them toward the open night. The horses reared, their hooves striking sparks against the wooden floor. "Easy, easy," Laura whispered hoarsely, though her voice cracked. She tugged at the stall latch, her palms burning against hot iron. At last, the gates swung open, and the animals bolted, nearly knocking her down as they thundered toward freedom. Her lungs screamed for air. She should run. She should leave. But she remembered Sarah's voice, trembling with tears. Daisy. Through the haze, Laura spotted the shelf in the tack room. The flames had begun to climb the walls, gnawing through hay and timber. She stumbled toward it, swiping at sparks that landed on her sleeves. Her hands closed around the small, soot-stained rag doll. And then, a beam above cracked with a deafening roar. Laura looked up just as it split, collapsing. She froze, but strong arms shoved her sideways, hard enough that she hit the ground with the breath knocked from her chest. The beam crashed where she had been, sparks exploding in a storm of embers. Clayton's voice thundered in her ear. "Are you mad, girl? You'll kill yourself." She coughed violently, clutching Daisy in one hand. "Sarah, she needs your doll." Clayton cursed, scooping her into his arms as though she weighed nothing. The heat was unbearable, his shirt already singed at the edges. He barreled through the smoke, ducking low, his body shielding hers as the barn groaned and split apart around them. They burst into the night air, Laura gasping and choking, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. Thomas and Annie were hauling buckets, their arms trembling from effort, while Sarah clutched her blanket, eyes wide with terror. Laura staggered free of Clayton's grip, falling to her knees in the dirt. She held Daisy out to Sarah, her hand shaking. "Here, sweetheart, she's safe." The little girl let out a cry of joy, hugging the doll to her chest as though it were life itself. "Thank you, Miss Laura." Annie's buckets clattered to the ground. She stared at Laura as though seeing her for the first time, not as a stranger, not as an intruder, but as someone who had risked her very life for them. Thomas's face, smeared with soot, shone with awe. "You went in, you saved them all." Laura's body trembled, her lungs raw, but she met their gazes with tears in her eyes. "I couldn't let you lose more. Not the animals, not Daisy. You've already lost enough." The barn was half collapsed by the time the last flames died to smoldering embers. The animals, though shaken, stood safe in the paddock. Smoke hung heavy, the night broken by the charred skeleton of what had once sheltered their livelihood. Clayton stood apart, his hands braced on his knees, his chest heaving. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes lit with something fierce and unreadable as he stared at Laura. She rose unsteadily, wrapping her shawl tighter around her scorched sleeves. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clayton's voice, low and hoarse, broke the silence. "You nearly died tonight." Laura swallowed hard. "But the children needed me. You needed me." She hesitated, her voice trembling. "I couldn't stand by." Clayton's jaw worked, his gray eyes blazing with unspoken words. At last, he only said, "You're braver than most men I've known." The children clustered around her then, Thomas with pride, Sarah with pure adoration, and even Annie, who slipped her small hand into Laura's without a word. In that moment, Laura realized she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just a girl who had been given away. She was someone the children trusted, someone who belonged. The ranch house was quiet after the fire. Too quiet. The children had fallen into an exhausted sleep, huddled together on quilts laid out by the hearth. Their small bodies twitched with dreams, but their breaths were steady, soot-darkened cheeks pressed to one another for comfort. Laura sat at the table, her hands trembling as she poured water into a basin. Her arms ached, her lungs still raw, and strands of her hair were singed short. Every inch of her smelled of smoke. But her eyes kept drifting to the man sitting across from her, silent and grim. Clayton. He had taken the brunt of the fire's wrath, his shirt scorched, the skin along his forearms raw and blistering where he had shielded her. His jaw was set, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed the pain he wouldn't speak aloud. Laura dipped a cloth into the cool water and carried it to him. "You should let me clean those burns," she whispered. "I've had worse," he muttered, turning slightly away. Her lips pressed tight. She had learned enough in these weeks to know how to press gently, but firmly. "Maybe you've had worse. But you didn't have me then. Please, let me help. His eyes lifted, storm gray and unreadable, but after a long pause, he gave a single, reluctant nod. Laura knelt beside him. The flicker of the firelight painted his face in shifting golds and shadows. She wrung the cloth and pressed it carefully against his arm. He hissed softly, his muscles tensing under her touch. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "Don't be." His voice was rough, hoarse from smoke. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. As she worked, she saw the truth written in his flesh, skin reddened, blistering in angry patches, scars of older wounds hidden beneath. This was a man who had given his body to hardship and never complained. Her fingers trembled as they worked the salve into the burns. He sat motionless, watching her, the weight of his gaze almost unbearable. "You could have died tonight," he said suddenly. Laura's hand stilled. "So could you. That's different." "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because I've lived. You're just starting. You shouldn't throw yourself into flames for things that could be replaced." Her eyes filled, though she fought the tears. They weren't just things. The animals feed you, clothe you. And that doll, Sarah loves it like family. You can't replace family. The words hung heavy in the air. Clayton's eyes softened, just for a heartbeat. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw the grief flicker there, deep and unhealed. Laura's voice dropped. "You loved her, didn't you? Your wife." His body stiffened, his shoulders rising. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Mary was everything. She gave me those children. She gave me laughter in a world that's more often silent. And then, she was gone. One day sick, the next buried. The children needed me, and he broke off, shaking his head. "I've been trying to hold us together ever since." Laura swallowed hard, her heart aching at the rawness in his tone. She reached up, daring to touch his hand where it rested, scarred and calloused, on his knee. "You've carried so much alone." His gaze snapped to hers, startled by the gentleness in her words. For a moment, the firelight glinted in his eyes, and she thought, just thought, he might let the walls crumble further. Instead, he drew a slow breath, his voice lower now. "And what about you? Do you regret it? Being here, being bound to me?" The question pierced her. She had asked herself that same thing 100 times, standing on the porch, lying awake in the loft, hearing the wind lash against the house. Laura drew in a steadying breath. "I was given to you. I didn't choose it. But tonight, when the fire raged, I wasn't thinking of my uncle or what people whisper in town. I was thinking of Sarah and Thomas and Annie, of you. And all I knew was I couldn't let this family break apart again." Her voice trembled, but her gaze held his. "So no, I don't regret it." Silence stretched. The crackle of the hearth filled the room, broken only by the soft breaths of the sleeping children. Clayton stared at her, something shifting in his expression, something almost tender, almost dangerous. His hand twitched, as if to cover hers. But then he pulled back, rising stiffly to his feet. "You should rest," he said gruffly. "You've done enough for one night." Laura's throat tightened with unspoken words. She wanted to tell him that she didn't fear his scars, or his grief, or his silence. That she was no longer just a girl given away. That she needed to matter here. But she only nodded, gathering the basin and cloths, forcing her hands to stay steady. As she turned toward the kitchen, Clayton's voice came, low and almost lost beneath the crackle of embers. "You're stronger than I thought, Laura May." Her breath caught. She turned, but his face was already shadowed, unreadable again. Still, the words lingered in her heart, warming her more than the fire ever could. That night, Laura lay awake in the loft, the children curled near her. Outside, the ranch still smelled of smoke, the barn nothing but blackened bones against the sky. But inside, something new stirred in her chest, fragile, tentative but real. A seed of belonging, a seed of love. The weeks after the fire blurred into a season of rebuilding. Neighbors came to help, bringing spare boards and tools, for in those days a man's loss was everyone's burden. The barn rose again, plank by plank, rough but sturdy, and Clayton's land breathed life once more. Laura worked tirelessly beside him and the children. Her hands blistered, her skirts muddied, but she never complained. She fetched nails, held beams in place, and wiped sweat from her brow with the same determination that had driven her into the flames. The children clung closer than ever. Sarah followed Laura like her own shadow. Thomas bragged in town about our Laura saving the animals, and Annie, once coldest of all, had begun to linger at her side, asking questions about sewing, baking, even brushing her hair. Laura's heart swelled with each small victory. For the first time, she did not feel like a girl borrowed or given. She felt like part of something whole. One evening, when the last board had been nailed and the animals safely returned to their stalls, the ranch seemed to sigh in relief. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with ribbons of pink and gold. The children ran inside, eager for supper, but Clayton lingered by the new barn door, his hand resting against the fresh wood. Laura hesitated, then walked toward him, her shawl wrapped tight against the lingering chill. "It looks strong," she said softly. "It'll hold," he answered, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, after a pause, "So will we." The words sent warmth flooding her chest. They walked together to the pasture fence, silence stretching comfortably between them. A lark sang somewhere in the dusk, and the smell of damp earth promised spring. At last, Clayton spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain. "Laura May, I've been thinking about that night, about you." Her breath caught. She turned slightly, her eyes searching his face. "What about me?" He exhaled slowly, his jaw working as if every word had to be pried loose. "When your uncle handed you over, I thought it was wrong. Thought you were too young, thought you'd wither out here. I told myself I didn't need more weight on my shoulders. Just needed a cook, someone to mind the children. Nothing more." Laura's throat tightened. She lowered her gaze to the ground. But then his voice cracked, rough with truth. "Then you walked into fire. You held my children when they cried. You mended what I thought was broken beyond repair. And I realized, I don't just need you here. I want you here." Her eyes flew to his, wide with disbelief. Clayton's gray gaze locked onto hers, unflinching now. "Laura May, I've been a fool, trying to keep my heart buried with Mary. But you show me it still beats. For this family. For you." Her breath came uneven, her heart racing in her chest. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not born of sorrow. "You mean that?" "I do." His voice was steady now, certain. "I don't want you to feel like you were given to me or trapped here. I want you to stay because it's what you choose. Because you feel what he faltered, then whispered, "What I feel." Laura's hands trembled as she gripped the fence rail. For so long she had carried fear, that she was a burden, an outsider, a girl forced into a man's house. But now, standing beneath the fading light, all she felt was truth rising in her chest. "I was afraid at first," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Afraid of you, of the children, of the life waiting here. But I'm not afraid anymore, because somewhere along the way, this place became home. And you," she swallowed hard, tears spilling freely now, "you became the reason my heart beats too." Clayton stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth of him, smell the smoke still clinging faintly to his shirt. His calloused hand rose, hovering at her cheek as if asking permission. Laura leaned into it, her skin burning at his touch. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. But she didn't. She couldn't. Their lips met in a kiss as soft as spring rain, trembling with the weight of all they had not said, all they had held back. When they parted, Laura's forehead rested against his chest, his heart thundering beneath her ear. "I love you," she whispered, the words trembling free at last. His arms wrapped around her, strong and certain. "And I you, more than I ever thought I could again." From the doorway, unseen, Annie, Thomas, and Sarah peeked out, their faces breaking into wide smiles. For the first time since their mother's passing, their home felt whole again. The wind, once cruel, now carried the scent of earth and new beginnings. And for Laura May, the girl who had once stood trembling on a porch, given away like a parcel, Life had become something she had never dreamed possible. A family, a love chosen, a home forever hers.